The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the walls, thick with unspoken conclusions. Judge Robert Stanton leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly gripping his gavel, his expression carved from years of unchallenged authority. Across the room, Officer Michael Dorsey and Officer Anthony Hayes stood tall in their uniforms, hands resting on their duty belts, exuding the confidence of men who had played this game before and always won. A few feet away, the accused woman, Celeste Harris, sat still, her navy blue blazer unwrinkled, her posture unreadable. The fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp reflections on the polished wood of the judge's bench, highlighting the deep lines of Stanton's face as he cleared his throat. This court finds that the evidence against Officers Dorsey and Hayes is insufficient to proceed with any formal charges. Therefore, a chair scraped against the floor. Celeste stood. "Before you rule, Your Honor." Her voice was controlled, smooth as glass, yet carrying the weight of something razor-sharp beneath. "I'd like to remind the court that I am a federal prosecutor." The world tilted. A shockwave passed through the room, rippling from the jury to the gallery to the bailiff standing by the door. The murmurs rose first, low, disbelieving, like the rumble of distant thunder before a storm. Judge Stanton's grip tightened around his gavel. His mouth opened, then closed. Dorsey flinched. Hayes' self-assured grin melted, replaced by something tighter, more uncertain. Even Celeste's own court-appointed defender turned to her in stunned disbelief. The air shifted, crackling with new tension. Stanton blinked, his composure fracturing. "You?" Celeste reached into her blazer and retrieved a badge, its golden emblem glinting under the artificial lighting. "Celeste Harris, Assistant U.S. Attorney," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I'd like to see you dismiss my case now, Your Honor." For the first time in his career, Judge Robert Stanton was speechless. 3 weeks earlier, Celeste had been just another black woman in a quiet suburban coffee shop, ordering a latte after a long day. She had barely noticed the police cruiser parked outside, barely registered the 2 officers seated inside. But they had noticed her. The siren's abrupt chirp had frozen her steps just as she reached her car. "Hey, you." She turned, confused. Officer Dorsey and Officer Hayes approached, hands lingering too close to their weapons. "What's your business around here?" Hayes asked, looking her up and down with a gaze that suggested she didn't belong. Celeste had sighed, already recognizing the script. "Just getting coffee. I work downtown. Got any ID?" She had reached into her bag carefully, aware of the weight of their stares, of the familiar edge of suspicion in their voices. When she handed them her driver's license, Dorsey barely glanced at it before snapping, "You got anything else in that bag?" Celeste had forced herself to stay composed. "Just my wallet. And my work badge." A smirk from Hayes. "Work badge? What, you a janitor or something?" Her fingers had tightened around the strap of her purse. "I'm a federal prosecutor." Silence. A pause just long enough to let hope creep in. Then Dorsey chuckled. "Oh yeah? And I'm the President of the United States." The handcuffs were on her wrists before she could argue. "You're under arrest." "For what?" "Resisting an investigation." They had pushed her into the back of their cruiser as a handful of bystanders watched from the sidewalk, some concerned, others indifferent. No one had stepped in. Celeste had spent the night in a holding cell, her title mocked, her credentials ignored. The officers had laughed when she told them who she was. "No way, you're a U.S. attorney," the desk sergeant had sneered, filing her fingerprints like she was just another case number. "Nice try, though." She had sat on that cold bench, breathing through her anger, thinking, planning. 3 weeks later, she stood in this courtroom, looking into the eyes of the men who had humiliated her, waiting for the judge to speak. But Stanton couldn't. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, struggling to regain control of a situation that had spun wildly out of his grasp. He wasn't just about to dismiss a case anymore. He was about to dismiss a federal prosecutor's case in front of an entire courtroom that had just realized exactly how deep this injustice ran. And outside, beyond the courtroom doors, reporters were already typing, social media was already buzzing, and Celeste Harris had just changed the game. The silence stretched unbearably. The gavel trembled slightly in Stanton's grip. And then, the courtroom doors swung open. A man in a sharp gray suit strode inside, a thick folder in hand. His presence alone cut through the tension like a blade. Judge Stanton latched onto the distraction, his voice unsteady. "And you are?" The man smirked, adjusting his tie. Special Investigator Jonathan Pierce, Internal Affairs. Celeste's stomach tightened. She hadn't planned for this. The case had just taken a turn no one expected. And for the first time since the trial began, she wasn't sure what was coming next. A wave of murmurs washed over the courtroom like a rising tide, murmurs that carried the scent of something rotten finally being exposed to the light. Judge Robert Stanton, a man whose authority had never been questioned in this space, found himself gripping the edge of his bench as if it could anchor him against the shifting current. Special Investigator Jonathan Pierce had walked in with a confidence that unsettled him. His sharp gray suit and the folder in his hand signaled something Stanton didn't like: unpredictability. He was used to controlling the courtroom, dictating the rhythm of justice, but now the tempo had changed. It was no longer his to command. Celeste Harris remained standing, her presence unshaken. The weight of the moment pressed against her ribs, but she refused to let it show. The courtroom was now a pressure chamber, and she had been inside one before. The difference was, this time, she wasn't the one suffocating. Pierce's eyes scanned the room before landing on the judge, assessing him like a predator, deciding how much effort it would take to bring him down. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Pierce said, his tone light, almost amused. Stanton's jaw tightened. "This is highly irregular, investigator. We are in the middle of a ruling." His voice was even, but the slight tremor in his hand betrayed him. Pierce tilted his head. "Oh, I'm aware. I also happen to be in possession of new evidence that could directly impact this case." He lifted the folder slightly, as if to let its presence settle in. "I believe it's in the court's best interest to review it before any premature dismissals take place." Stanton exhaled through his nose. He was cornered, and he knew it. If he refused to consider the evidence, the scrutiny would be unbearable. Cameras were already rolling. The room was thick with the scent of something unraveling, something far bigger than he had anticipated. Officer Dorsey shifted in his seat. He wasn't smiling anymore. His fingers drummed lightly against his knee, a rhythm betraying the nerves he tried to suppress. Hayes, always the smoother of the two, maintained a stony expression, but Celeste could see the flicker of calculation in his eyes. He was already working through possible exits, possible ways to spin this to their advantage. They were the ones being scrutinized now. The same system that had protected them countless times before was suddenly hesitating. Stanton reached for his gavel, perhaps to restore a sense of control, but his grip was too tight, and it slipped slightly from his grasp before he caught it. A moment of weakness, but a moment nonetheless. Pierce took a step forward. "Shall I proceed, Your Honor?" For a moment, it seemed like Stanton might refuse, might find some loophole to evade this. But then his gaze flickered toward Celeste, standing there, waiting, unwavering. He could see the fire in her eyes, the kind of fire that didn't extinguish itself. "Proceed," he muttered, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. Pierce opened the folder, pulling out a crisp stack of documents. He didn't immediately offer them. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of anticipation settle before speaking again. "These are newly obtained surveillance and body camera recordings from the night of Ms. Harris's arrest," he said, his voice casual but deliberate. "Recordings that, until recently, were reported as unavailable due to technical malfunctions." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Celeste's fingers twitched slightly. She had requested the footage before, only to be met with excuses. Now, suddenly, it had materialized. That meant one thing: someone had been keeping it buried until now. Stanton shifted in his seat, but said nothing. Pierce continued. "The footage presents a very different account from the one provided by Officers Dorsey and Hayes in their official report. In fact," he glanced at the officers, "it contradicts nearly every claim they've made." Dorsey inhaled sharply, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. Hayes didn't move. Pierce placed a USB drive on the prosecution's table. "I'd like to request a review of the footage in the presence of the court." Stanton hesitated. He could feel the courtroom tightening around him, squeezing against the carefully constructed foundation he had built over the years. He had dismissed cases like this before, dozens of them, without a second thought. But this was different. This wasn't some nameless defendant. This was a federal prosecutor, standing in his courtroom, watching every move he made. If he refused, he would be seen as complicit. If he allowed it, he risked losing everything. A no-win situation. His worst nightmare. A deep breath. A clenched jaw. "The request is granted," he said, the words heavy and reluctant. Pierce nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. The bailiff moved swiftly, retrieving the USB and plugging it into the courtroom's projection system. The screen flickered to life, and for the first time, the truth was about to be laid bare for everyone to see. Celeste exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The officers were about to watch their carefully crafted lie crumble around them. And for the first time since her arrest, she was the one in control. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. A grainy image appeared, the timestamp in the corner marking the night Celeste Harris had been arrested. The footage was from a security camera outside the coffee shop, an angle she hadn't expected. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Every set of eyes was locked on the screen. Judge Stanton's fingers tensed on his gavel, his knuckles paling. Officers Dorsey and Hayes sat unnaturally still, as if hoping that sheer willpower could alter what was about to be revealed. The footage played. Celeste, unaware of what was coming, stepped out of the coffee shop, her latte in one hand, her phone in the other. Her posture was relaxed, casual, just another professional woman heading home after a long day. Then came the squad car. The cruiser slowed as it neared, the siren giving a sharp, unnecessary chirp. The officers emerged, hands already hovering over their weapons, eyes locked onto her like she was prey. In the courtroom, Celeste could hear the collective inhalation of the crowd, as if they were witnessing the moment a trap was about to be sprung. On screen, the conversation began. "Hey, you." Celeste's past self turned, confusion flickering across her face. "What's your business around here?" The tone wasn't one of curiosity. It was one of expectation, a test she was already failing. The footage had audio, crisp and clear. "I just bought coffee," her voice played over the speakers. "I work in the city." A beat. Then Hayes' smug response. "Got any ID?" In the courtroom, Pierce barely shifted, but Celeste noticed the flicker of satisfaction in his expression. He had known what was coming. On the footage, she reached into her purse slowly, deliberately, the way every black person in America had been conditioned to move under police scrutiny. She handed them her license. Dorsey barely glanced at it. "You got anything else in that bag?" The room tensed. The moment played out exactly as she remembered, but now everyone could see it for what it was. Escalation without cause, suspicion without evidence. "Just my wallet. And my work badge." "Work badge? What, you a janitor or something?" A sharp inhale somewhere in the gallery. A murmur rippled through the observers. Celeste's grip tightened on the edge of the table. The footage zoomed in slightly, catching the tension in her jaw as she answered, "I'm a federal prosecutor." The next moment was a telltale silence, the moment where the officers had a choice. The moment where logic should have dictated their next move. But instead, Dorsey had chuckled. "Oh yeah, and I'm the President of the United States." And then came the part she had dreaded reliving. "Put your hands on the hood." The courtroom gasped. Celeste had barely gotten a word out before Dorsey was grabbing her arm, twisting it behind her back. Hayes was already reaching for the cuffs, his grip rough, unnecessary. For what? The answer had been absurd then. It was infuriating now. Resisting an investigation. Celeste's past self had barely moved, had barely had a chance to process the absurdity of it before she was shoved into the squad car. The screen froze. The silence that followed was suffocating. Celeste didn't turn to see the faces of the officers. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of the courtroom shifting, the collective realization settling in like an undeniable truth. Judge Stanton looked like he had swallowed glass. His gavel lay untouched, his usual authority drained from his posture. Pierce let the silence stretch for just a few seconds longer before speaking, his voice deliberately calm. "Shall I continue?" Stanton didn't respond. He didn't need to. The footage resumed. A new angle body cam footage. The image wobbled slightly as Hayes reached for Celeste's arm, yanking it higher than necessary. And then, the words that would haunt them. A grainy chuckle from Dorsey. "Nah, bro, look at her. Black woman, nice clothes. She's either scamming or she's a lawyer." Another pause. "She said she was a prosecutor." And then the final blow, the nail in the coffin that even Stanton couldn't ignore. Reynolds' dismissive snort. "Yeah, and I said I was the President of the United States." The screen went black. For the first time in Judge Stanton's courtroom, justice wasn't in his hands. The gallery exploded into murmurs, some angry, some stunned. Someone cursed under their breath. A reporter scribbled notes feverishly. Celeste exhaled slowly, her pulse steady, controlled. She turned to the officers. Dorsey looked as though he might be sick. Hayes had gone completely still, his eyes darting towards Stanton as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. Judge Stanton's throat worked around words he couldn't form. He had dismissed cases like this before, swept injustices under the rug without consequence. But not this time. This time, the evidence was undeniable. This time, the entire courtroom had seen the truth. Pierce leaned back slightly, his satisfaction subtle but clear. Celeste's voice cut through the murmurs, smooth as steel. "I'd like to see you dismiss my case now, Your Honor." Stanton flinched. The power had shifted. The real question was, what would he do next? Judge Robert Stanton sat motionless, his face unreadable, but Celeste could see the tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift in his grip on the gavel. He was calculating, searching for an exit, a way to regain control before the courtroom collapsed around him. But there was no easy escape. The air had thickened, humming with restrained energy. The gallery was no longer just an audience. It was a storm, waiting to break. A few whispers cut through the silence, the murmurs of people who had spent their lives watching stories like this play out without consequence. Only this time, the ending had changed. The officers weren't supposed to look nervous. And yet, here they were, Dorsey's shoulders stiff, his eyes darting between Stanton and Pierce, while Hayes had finally lost his practice smirk. Their confidence had been stripped away, laid bare by the very system they had trusted to protect them. Stanton's hesitation stretched. He was a man who had never had to explain himself before. His authority had been absolute until now. Then he did something Celeste hadn't expected. He exhaled, slow and measured, then reached for the folder beside him. The motion was deliberate, meant to buy time. He opened it, skimmed the papers as though some hidden clause might save him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone forcing himself to remain in control. This, he cleared his throat, a rare moment of unease, is an unprecedented situation. Unprecedented. A word people like Stanton used when the usual script had been rewritten, when the system no longer bent the way it was supposed to. Celeste didn't move. She let the silence stretch, let him stew in it. The courtroom was watching. Cameras were rolling. Reporters were taking notes that would become headlines by morning. Stanton couldn't ignore the evidence, not with Pierce standing there like a shadow cast over his bench. But he also couldn't openly condemn the officers without unraveling years of carefully maintained precedent. "I will need time," Stanton continued, "to review this footage in full before making a final ruling." A stall tactic. Desperate grasp at control. Celeste felt the flicker of disappointment ripple through the room. People had seen enough. They didn't need time to process what had happened. This was the kind of injustice that spoke for itself. Pierce, however, was already one step ahead. "Your Honor," he said, voice smooth but firm, "with all due respect, the footage is clear. There is no ambiguity in what was shown here today." A warning. Stanton knew it. His lips pressed into a thin line. "I am aware of what was shown, investigator," he said, voice sharper now, defensive. "But legal procedure dictates that a review is necessary." Another stall. Celeste resisted the urge to exhale too sharply. She had known he would try this, that he would delay in hopes the pressure would ease. But she had no intention of letting that happen. "The footage is damning, Your Honor," she said, her tone steady but edged. "And it isn't just about me. It's about the fact that these officers felt emboldened enough to behave this way because they believed they would face no consequences. That belief," she let her gaze sweep across the room, settling briefly on Dorsey and Hayes before turning back to the judge, wasn't baseless. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the audience. Celeste let the words linger, let them sink in. She wasn't accusing just two officers. She was drawing a line that led directly to the system itself. And that system had a face. Stanton's. The judge's fingers tightened on the edge of his bench. He didn't like being put in this position, didn't like the way the air in the room had shifted against him. Dorsey finally moved, his voice breaking the silence for the first time since the footage had played. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. The words were barely audible, but the tension in them was clear. Hayes, usually the calmer of the two, was rigid now. His hands were clasped together too tightly, his pulse visible at his temple. They had come into this courtroom expecting another easy dismissal. They had not prepared for this. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen, hanging on the edge of something unseen. Then Stanton made a mistake. Instead of ruling in favor of the truth, instead of seizing the opportunity to restore even a sliver of credibility, he clung to the only power he had left. "This court is adjourned," he declared, striking his gavel against the bench. The sound cracked through the air, but it was hollow, empty of the finality he wanted it to carry. Celeste exhaled. Of course. He was hoping to escape the moment, hoping the pressure would lessen by tomorrow, hoping the headlines would shift. But Celeste had no intention of letting him slip through the cracks. As the courtroom erupted into noise, people rising, murmurs escalating, reporters scrambling, she turned to Pierce. "He's going to try to bury this." Pierce smirked slightly, as if he had been expecting nothing less. "Let him try," he murmured. "That's the mistake they always make." Dorsey and Hayes were already moving toward the exit, their strides quick but not hurried. Controlled panic. Celeste watched them go. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the tension didn't leave with the people. It clung to the walls, heavy and suffocating. Judge Stanton had thought he could escape the pressure, that adjourning the court would buy him time. But there were things even a gavel couldn't silence. Outside, reporters swarmed, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony of questions and speculation. The moment the footage had played, the story had escaped the walls of the courthouse and spread like wildfire. There would be no containing it now. Celeste didn't rush to leave. She remained seated, watching the way the officers moved. Dorsey kept his head down, his jaw tight. Hayes, however, scanned the room as he walked, eyes darting from person to person as if searching for an ally. There were none. Not anymore. Pierce lingered beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the judge retreat toward his chambers like a man walking toward his own execution. The arrogant Stanton had carried in the beginning had thinned, his confidence reduced to something frail and breakable. "You see that?" Pierce murmured. Celeste nodded slightly. Stanton had looked over his shoulder 3 times before exiting. A small thing, but telling. A man like that didn't look behind him unless he was afraid of what followed. Celeste rose, smoothing the fabric of her blazer, her movements calm despite the storm that brewed just outside. "He's rattled," she said, keeping her voice even. "But that doesn't mean he'll break." Pierce exhaled through his nose. "Not yet." They walked together, the weight of what had happened settling between them like a third presence. The hallway outside was flooded with noise, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, the murmur of people trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Celeste stepped forward, and the swarm turned its attention toward her. "Ms. Harris, do you have a statement? What's your response to Judge Stanton delaying the ruling? Do you think the officers will face actual consequences?" She didn't slow her stride, didn't falter. These people weren't asking because they wanted the truth, they were asking because they wanted a headline. Still, she knew the importance of a single, well-placed sentence. So just before stepping past the crowd, she turned slightly, meeting their expectant gazes. "The system doesn't get to decide when accountability happens anymore," she said simply. The words were enough. The flashes of cameras lit up the hallway like lightning before a storm. Beside her, Pierce let out a low chuckle as they pushed through the exit. "Not bad," he muttered. Celeste didn't reply. She was already thinking ahead. This wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until Stanton was forced to rule, until Dorsey and Hayes were held accountable, and she knew exactly where to apply pressure. Somewhere in the city, behind closed doors and expensive desks, a different kind of conversation was happening. Judge Stanton sat rigid in his leather chair, his office dark except for the dim glow of a lamp on the corner of his desk. His phone sat between his hands, a call on hold, the line humming faintly in his ear. A few hours ago, he had been in control. Now, everything was unraveling. He should have dismissed the case before it reached this point. He should have shut it down the moment Harris walked into his courtroom. But he had underestimated her. The system wasn't supposed to fail men like him. And yet, here he was. The call clicked back in. A voice, smooth and sharp, filled the quiet. "This is a mess, Robert." Stanton's fingers twitched slightly. He had spent years listening to that voice, taking instruction, keeping things quiet. He had never heard it sound displeased. "I know," he muttered. "I don't think you do. This isn't just another case. That footage is everywhere. Do you understand what happens if this doesn't go away? Stanton exhaled sharply. I just need time. You don't have time. The voice was cold. You're going to fix this. How? His frustration bled into the words. Harris isn't backing down. Pierce has internal affairs watching every move. If I rule in favor of the officers, I'll burn for it. A pause. Then a low chuckle. You're already burning, Robert. The call ended. Stanton let the phone drop onto the desk, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his career, he had no idea how to escape. Dorsey sat in his car, parked in an empty lot, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. He hadn't spoken much after court. Neither had Hayes. They had left the building as quickly as possible, but even then, it had felt like eyes were everywhere, watching, judging. The footage had been a disaster. No one was supposed to see it, but someone had leaked it. And now it wasn't just Harris they had to worry about. Dorsey pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages piling up. Some were from numbers he didn't recognize, probably reporters. Others were from people he had worked with for years. The tone had shifted. They weren't defending him anymore. They were distancing themselves. One message stood out. We need to talk. No? Hayes. Dorsey stared at the screen for a moment before tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They had been protected before. They had walked out of situations like this untouched. So why did it feel like the floor had just been ripped out from under them? Celeste sat in her office. The city stretched out beyond a window, lights flickering in the distance. The fight wasn't over. Not even close. She had spent years knowing how these stories ended, how people like Dorsey and Hayes walked free, while the victims were left to carry the weight of their decisions. But not this time. This time, the system had to answer for itself. And she would make sure it did. Judge Robert Stanton's office felt colder than usual. The dim glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows across the polished wood, stretching over the stacks of case files, most of which would never see the inside of a courtroom. He sat with his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles paling under the pressure. The weight of the phone call from earlier still sat heavy in his chest. The system wasn't failing. It was turning on him. He had spent decades crafting a career where his decisions were unquestioned, where his rulings were merely a formality that kept everything moving as intended. He had thought he was untouchable. But Harris had changed that. The footage had changed that. Now he wasn't just a judge overseeing a case, he was a man standing at the edge of a crumbling foundation, and there was no way to tell how far the drop would be once it gave way. He leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes drift to the ceiling. The call had been a warning, but it was also an order. He was expected to make this disappear. The problem was, he no longer had the power to do that. The moment that footage had played in court, the story had spread beyond his reach. The public wanted answers. The press wanted blood. And Harris wanted justice. He exhaled sharply, reaching for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he dialed. Few rings. Then an answer. We have a problem, Stanton muttered. The voice on the other end sighed. No kidding. Dorsey sat in the driver's seat of his car, parked in a secluded area behind an old service station. The city lights flickered in the distance, but here, in the quiet, he could almost pretend none of this was happening. Almost. His phone buzzed beside him, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. But he knew who it was. He answered. We're screwed. Hayes' voice was tight, stripped of the usual bravado. You saw how they looked at us today. We don't have a way out of this. Dorsey's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. We just need to keep our heads down, he muttered. Let it blow over. Hayes let out a bitter laugh. Blow over. Do you even hear yourself? This isn't some bad PR moment, man. This is career ending. Worse. Silence stretched between them. Dorsey closed his eyes. He had spent his entire career knowing that no matter what happened, the system would protect them. They had always been on the right side of the shield, the side that didn't take the fall. But Harris had shifted the balance. No one was defending them now. Not even Stanton. So what do we do? Hayes asked after a beat. Dorsey hesitated. He wasn't sure there was an answer. But then his phone buzzed again. A message. Unknown number. We need to meet. No. His stomach twisted. He didn't recognize the number, but the implication was clear. Someone was watching, and someone wanted to talk. Celeste stood by the window of her office, arms crossed, her reflection barely visible against the dark glass. The city below stretched endlessly, glowing in patches where the streets were still alive with movement. She had expected Stanton to delay. She had expected resistance. But she also knew what desperation looked like. And Stanton was running out of options. Pierce leaned against her desk, arms folded, watching her with that unreadable expression he always wore when something was about to shift. You think he's going to try something? Celeste didn't answer right away. She had been thinking about that exact question since leaving the courtroom. Yes, she said finally. He doesn't have a choice. Pierce exhaled, his fingers drumming lightly against his bicep. Then we need to be ready. Celeste nodded. She was always ready. Dorsey pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse, the kind of place that smelled like rust and old regrets. Hayes was already there, leaning against his own car, arms crossed, his posture wound tight with nerves. Neither of them spoke as Dorsey stepped out, scanning the area. The message hadn't come with instructions, just a location. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Judge Stanton. Dorsey's breath caught for half a second before he forced himself to mask it. This wasn't normal. A judge meeting with two officers in a place like this? It reeked of something dangerous. Judge, Hayes greeted stiffly. Stanton's face was taut, his eyes shadowed in the dim light. You're in trouble, he said bluntly. Dorsey exchanged a look with Hayes but said nothing. Stanton stepped closer. The system isn't going to protect you this time. Dorsey's throat tightened. You're on your own. Hayes let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Well, that's just fantastic. Stanton ignored him, his gaze locked on Dorsey. I need this to go away. Dorsey's mouth went dry. And how do you expect us to do that? For the first time, Stanton hesitated. It was subtle, a fraction of a second, but Dorsey caught it. The judge didn't have a plan. He was grasping, hoping they would provide him with an answer. You have options, Stanton said, though the words felt forced. Figure something out. Fast. He turned, walking back toward the shadows. Dorsey watched him go, his pulse drumming against his temples. Hayes cursed under his breath. We're dead. Dorsey didn't answer. For the first time in his life, he believed it. Celeste stared at the email that had just landed in her inbox. Anonymous sender. Be careful. They're meeting tonight. The judge is involved. A chill ran through her. She had expected desperation. But not this. She grabbed her coat, her heart pounding as she turned to Pierce. We need to move. Pierce straightened immediately. What's wrong? She handed him her phone. He scanned the message, his jaw tightening. Well, that's interesting. Celeste didn't hesitate. They're planning something, she said. And I want to know what it is. She was already heading for the door, Pierce right behind her. The fight was shifting. And if Stanton thought he could control the outcome, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The city streets blurred past in streaks of dim orange and flickering neon as Celeste drove, her hands tight around the steering wheel. The message in her inbox was burned into her mind. Stanton was meeting with the officers. The implications of that were as clear as they were dangerous. Pierce sat beside her, his usual smirk absent, replaced by a focused intensity. His fingers tapped against his knee, a quiet, rhythmic motion that betrayed his own tension. They didn't speak much as they closed the distance to the location. There was no need. The weight of what they were walking into spoke louder than words. Celeste had seen men like Stanton before. Men who wielded power like a weapon, who made decisions that ruined lives and walked away without a second thought. But the difference between them and him, he was panicking. And when powerful men panicked, they made mistakes. Dorsey's heartbeat drummed in his ears as he leaned against his car, Hayes beside him, the cold biting through the tension in the air. The old warehouse loomed behind them, a relic of forgotten industry, its rusted metal siding barely holding itself together. The judge had called him here. That alone told Dorsey everything he needed to know. A man like Stanton didn't meet in places like this unless he was desperate. The judge's voice from earlier echoed in his mind. The system isn't going to protect you this time. They had built their careers on the assumption that there would always be a way out, that as long as they wore the badge, they would be shielded. Now that shield had cracks, and cracks had a way of breaking. The crunch of tires on gravel snapped Dorsey from his thoughts. Headlights sliced through the darkness as a sleek black sedan rolled into the lot. Stanton stepped out a moment later, his face cast in sharp shadows under the dim streetlights. Dorsey exhaled slowly. The judge moved with a deliberate slowness, his robe discarded in favor of a dark suit. He looked less like a man of the law and more like a man walking into something he didn't fully understand. "Judge," Hayes greeted, voice tight. Stanton barely acknowledged him. His focus was locked on Dorsey. "We need to act now," Stanton said. Dorsey narrowed his eyes. "What exactly does that mean?" A pause. Then, quieter, "We have to make this go away." Hayes shifted beside him. "And how do you suggest we do that?" Stanton exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "There are ways." The unspoken meaning slithered between them, curling around the spaces where legality used to exist. Dorsey had known this was coming. A desperate man didn't look for a legal way out. He looked for an escape. Hayes let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You're serious." Stanton didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulling out a small envelope. He extended it toward Dorsey. Dorsey didn't move. "What is this?" he asked. "A solution," Stanton said simply. Dorsey took the envelope, flipping it open. His pulse spiked as he took in the contents. An address, a name, price. His throat tightened. "You want this handled." Stanton met his gaze evenly. "I want this buried." Hayes let out a sharp breath, dragging a hand down his face. "This is insane." Stanton tilted his head. "You think you still have options?" Dorsey didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew the truth. They were already too far in. There was no walking away from this. Celeste parked the car just beyond the lot, killing the headlights. They moved quietly, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound between them. From the shadows, she could see the figures standing beneath the streetlight, their postures tense. Pierce exhaled beside her. "You were right. He's desperate." Celeste's eyes remained locked on the scene. "The question is, how desperate?" Then she saw the envelope. Her pulse kicked up. "Whatever that is, it's not good," Pierce muttered. Celeste nodded. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a deal. And they had just walked into the middle of it. Dorsey's grip on the envelope tightened. This was the moment. The one where the last threads of normalcy snapped. Stanton was giving them a choice. Do what needed to be done, or fall. Dorsey had spent his life making the kind of decisions that kept him on top. He had justified them, twisted them into something that sounded reasonable. But this was different. His throat felt tight. "What happens if we don't?" Stanton's expression didn't change. "Then you become the case instead of the enforcers." The words were quiet, but the threat in them was deafening. Hayes took a step back, shaking his head. "This is crazy." "We're not." A new sound cut through the air. Click. A gun being cocked. Every muscle in Dorsey's body locked. Then, a voice. "I wouldn't finish that sentence." Stanton stiffened. From the shadows, Celeste stepped forward, Pierce beside her, his badge flashing under the glow of the streetlight. For a second, no one moved. Then, slowly, Celeste smiled. "Looks like we got here just in time." The trap had been set, and it had just snapped shut. The night air was thick with tension, pressing in like a storm waiting to break. The cold glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, illuminating the frozen expressions of Stanton, Dorsey, and Hayes. The envelope, still clutched in Dorsey's hand, felt heavier than it should. Celeste took another step forward, her gaze locked onto the judge. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line. A man who had spent years controlling the pieces on the board, now realizing that he had just become one of them. Pierce stood beside her, his badge catching the dim light as he rested a hand near his holster. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to remind everyone exactly where this night was headed. Stanton exhaled slowly, his fingers twitching at his sides. "This isn't what it looks like." Celeste tilted her head, amusement flickering at the edges of her expression. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is." Dorsey and Hayes remained silent, their bodies stiff, their minds clearly racing for an escape route. There wasn't one. For a moment, no one moved. Then Stanton did something Celeste hadn't expected. He smiled. It was small, thin, and forced, but it was there. A last-ditch attempt to regain footing on ground that was already crumbling beneath him. "You don't have a case," he said, voice low, careful. "This is circumstantial at best. You don't have evidence of anything illegal." Celeste let the silence stretch, watching him, measuring the way his hands trembled ever so slightly. And then she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, pressed a button. The audio played crisp and clear in the quiet night air. Stanton's own voice. "We have to make this go away." Breath. "There are ways." The color drained from Stanton's face. Hayes took a step back, cursing under his breath. Dorsey's fingers clenched around the envelope. Pierce smirked. "You were saying?" Stanton's lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time, he had nothing to say. Celeste took another step forward, closing the space between them. "You thought this was still your game," she said, voice smooth, measured. "But it never was. Not really." Dorsey's jaw was tight, his eyes darting between Stanton and the recording. He was trying to gauge just how deep in he was, whether there was still a chance to save himself. Celeste saw the exact moment he realized the truth. There was no saving this. The only move left was survival. And survival meant flipping the board. "Stanton forced us into this," Dorsey blurted, his voice cracking slightly. "We didn't agree to anything yet." Stanton's head snapped toward him. "You spineless." "Shut up," Hayes interrupted, panic lacing his tone. "We didn't sign up for this. We thought—" He stopped himself. But it was too late. The confession hung in the air. Celeste's expression didn't change, but inside, she felt the shift. The power had finally, completely tipped. She turned her attention back to Stanton. "Your own people are abandoning you," she murmured. "I'd say that's checkmate." Stanton's face twisted. "You don't get it, do you?" Celeste starched a brow. Stanton's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "I'm not the only one pulling strings." She had expected him to say something like that. She had been waiting for it. But what surprised her was the way he said it. Not a threat, not arrogance, a warning. And that made her stomach tighten. For the first time that night, she felt the flicker of something close to unease. Because if Stanton was afraid of something bigger, something beyond himself, then this wasn't just a case. It was something else. Pierce must have sensed it too, because he shifted slightly, his smirk fading. "You can tell us all about that in interrogation," he said. "For now, you're under arrest." He reached for his cuffs. And that was when Stanton moved. Fast, reckless. A hand darted inside his coat, fingers closing around something Celeste couldn't see. Pierce reacted instantly. A gun was drawn. A command shouted. "Don't." Stanton froze. His hand hovered just over the handle of a weapon. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, he exhaled, releasing the grip. His fingers uncurled, leaving the gun where it was. Defeat settled over him like a heavy weight. Pierce stepped forward, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. "You just made this a whole lot worse for yourself," he muttered. Stanton didn't reply. Dorsey and Hayes were still frozen, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They had a choice now. Go down with him. Or save themselves. Celeste didn't need to say anything. She could already see the decision forming in their minds. They would talk. They always did. She let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders back as she took a step away. The night air felt different now, lighter, as if some invisible weight had finally begun to lift. Stanton was done. The case was closing. But that flicker of unease remained. Because in the end, it wasn't Stanton's fear that unsettled her. It was the fact that, for the first time since this began, she felt it too.